Hey guys, Paul here over on APS Amplifier. Today I wanted to talk about Yu-Gi-Oh cards that keep the peace, so to speak. And what I mean by that is Yu-Gi-Oh cards that sort of their existence prevents a certain problem or checks a certain problem, but not in like I guess as direct a way as you might think. Like it's direct, but it's not direct. I don't know. Okay, so you're probably wondering what's he talking about. I'll get into it with an easy example. It would be Nibiru, right? This is a card that it released in 2019 and has kind of had an impact on the metagame since. The way it works is if your opponent has summoned 5 or more monsters during this main phase, you can activate Nibiru, and its effect will tribute all monsters in the field and then summon itself and a token to your opponent's field. And so this is a huge way of punishing your opponent for summoning too much. It's a great check against combo decks because, if they don't have a way to actually negate Nibiru's effect, and that can be difficult, then they're going to lose their entire field, and that really sucks. It really can just like be turn ending. Some people compare it to Max C. I would argue that it has similarities, but it's probably more balanced than Max C is. But yeah, so that's kind of Nibiru's thing. It's really strong, it punishes combo decks, but on the other hand, if your opponent either A, does not summon 5 times in a turn, or B, is able to put up a monster negation by their 5th summon, I guess, before or by their 5th summon, then Nibiru is suddenly not so great. So there are some scenarios where it is or isn't good. And what ended up happening actually in the format that we just came out of, where Kashtira was extremely dominant, was Kashtira had 2 ways to play. They could do the zone lock, or they could do kind of just an Arise Heart control thing. And so both ways were really strong, and obviously a deck that can do both is really strong, but in order to make the zone locking play, they oftentimes would open themselves up to Nibiru in the process. So yes, locking out all of your opponent's zones makes for a really powerful, debilitating strategy, but if Nibiru can potentially, cut it off right there before it even really gets to finish, then you lose everything, and Kashtira was kind of vulnerable to that. Conversely, though, you could just end on a board of Kashtira Arise Heart and use its just banish effect along with the walking macrocosmos thing to just kind of control your opponent from there and slow roll grind them to a really easy victory. And so that's a simplified example, but it's basically to say that because Nibiru existed, the sort of zone lock, high summon version of Kashtira fell in popularity because they knew that it would lose to Nibiru. But then what ends up happening is, a few weeks pass and people are like, okay, well, I guess now that people aren't playing the zone lock version of Kashtira as often, and they're instead playing Rise Heart Control, well, I guess it's safe to take these Nibirus out of our main decks, right? Because people were main decking Nibiru. It was such a big threat that you had to have Nibiru in your main deck. So now people are kind of moving Nibiru to the side deck and things like that. And for a while, that was probably okay. But then a few more weeks pass, and what ends up happening is, well, the Kashtira players see, Nibiru play is kind of like, lowering, right? Like people aren't playing it as much. So I guess we can kind of get back to zone locking and be okay. And so now, the people who thought that it was okay to take their Nibirus out are getting their zones locked, and it's a whole thing. And it kind of just becomes this back and forth pendulum swing, right? And so I really am fascinated by those sorts of dynamics in Yu-Gi-Oh! I've always found those to be really interesting because there are people who hate Nibiru and think it's just, it's too good or whatever. There's some people who like it and think it does a good job of checking the meta. And there's plenty of similar cards, actually, I would say. Like Dark Ruler No More kind of fits the bill of something that combo players will hate this because it can be sacky. But then, some people feel like, well, it's the only choice that I have. And sometimes with cards like this, they actually affect the way that you build your deck, especially in anticipation of a tournament. Maybe your local tournament, it doesn't matter. It might just be a bit of a toss-up. But for people who are preparing for regionals or YCS events, this is highly relevant, and I just think that these sorts of things are really cool. So another sort of popular thing is just the hand trap dynamics, right? Some people, like hand traps, don't like them, but it's more, what I'm talking about here is just the fact that like certain hand traps come and go depending on like the popularity of certain other cards. There have been formats where Ghost Ogre was maybe seen as a better hand trap than Ash Blossom or Effect Veiler, partly because Ghost Ogre can hit certain continuous spells or field spells when they try to use their effects while they're in the field, or it can just get rid of a monster, and getting rid of a monster means that monster is no longer a threat on the field or no longer can be used as like, link material, Xyz material. Maybe you're trying to hit a card like Gigantic Sprite, where if you can use Ghost Ogre against its effect, it actually won't be able to detach, and so it won't be able to resolve. So there's all kinds of little scenarios where like a certain hand trap is more or less valuable just depending on the nature of things. Other examples that kind of come to mind for me here are things like these are more niche, but things like Waking the Dragon is something that you guys might remember. It's this trap where like you can use it, and if your opponent destroys it or banishes it, then it will let you summon any monster from your extra deck for free. So you could like summon a Raid Raptor Ultimate Falcon or something, which is just unaffected by everything and huge, and it heavily punishes your opponent for using spell trap removal. That used to be a really big thing. I remember when lots of spell trap removal was kind of more common. There have been formats like that in recent years where like main decking Lightning Storm, main decking Evenly Matched for like trap heavy decks, for instance, was a really big thing. But then as trap heavy decks leave the metagame, maybe those cards like go away. And I guess what I'm saying amidst it all is that I think that these sorts of cards, the sorts of cards where their existence changes how you approach deck building and how you approach plays and how you approach preparing for tournaments, are generally a good thing. Now, in the case of Nibiru, I know a lot of people like to compare it to Maxx C, like I said, and I think that Nibiru is kind of like the ideal Maxx C, a more balanced, better form of it, because, Maxx C, oh god, I feel like I'm going to just like wake up the sleeping beast talking about this card at all, but Maxx C is one of those cards where like you love it or you hate it, but it's even when you're like using it, it is just a polarizing card. Even if you do like it, you probably have to admit it can single-handedly swing games. It can just cut combo decks out of the equation sometimes, or it's going to be letting you draw like 10 cards and then they'll get beaten next turn, or it can like force them to end their turn. Or, if you get to play and then your opponent, like your opponent does their combo and then they have Maxx C, then when you get to play, they use Maxx C, and so now it's just, there's all kinds of things to be said about the card. But I think that Nibiru handles it a little bit better. It's not as ubiquitous and easy to use as Maxx C. It can be highly punishing and highly swingy in a game, but I think its existence is something that you can better account for. And I think that anytime a card like that exists, like where it's strong, it's swingy, but you kind of know what it is and what it's about, that's good card design in general. I know there's going to be exceptions. You can, argue with me in the comments all you want. I'm just saying that I think, generally speaking, a card that just affects that but isn't like altogether good in every single possible scenario is probably a pretty nice thing to have. There's something to be said. I kind of probably will make a separate video about this, but like, about cards that are like strong cards, but maybe not necessarily broken cards. I want to talk about that separately, but yeah, that's where I kind of think of like Access Code Talker, Zeus, where like there are people who want them banned, but also some people just think that they're like strong. We'll get into that another time. But I want to hear what you guys think about swingy cards, and maybe give me some examples of them that you guys have seen, and let me know what you think about them. Do you feel like something like Nibiru is good or bad? Do you think that different hand traps having different amounts of play based on the format is a good or a bad thing? Does it make it too hard to anticipate and too hard to plan, or would you say that that's something that's kind of a tool in a duelist sort of toolkit, so to speak? I'd love to hear it. Anyways, make sure you subscribe to APS Amplifier. If you want to chat with me more about this, then leave it down in the comments, or get at me on Twitter at Team APS. I'd love to talk to you there as well. Yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Fast turn.